Good morning, Pine Ridge. I hope you're all doing well. The other day, my family and I were playing a game called Who Does the Cat Love Most? In case you're wondering how our isolation is going, we may not have totally lost it, but it might be getting close. This idea was let's figure out who in the family our cat loves the most, and so it started with calling Domino, say, hey Domino, come to whoever you love the most. Eventually got to the point where we were saying, Domino, just look at whoever you love the most. And of course, he wasn't interested in playing this game, and so we had to call it a draw. I can guarantee if I had a can of food, then Domino would have loved me the most. That's besides the point. I think we sometimes do something similar with God. We tend to think that our situation is an indication of how God feels about us. I think I might have mentioned this story before, but when I was a youth pastor, it seemed like I often would plan an outdoor event and then we would have a rainstorm come and affect it. Not all the time, but often enough that it made me sometimes wonder, am I doing something wrong? Is God not blessing my ministry because of what's going on with the weather? And I realize that's basically the equivalent of saying, the volcano is erupting. We need to find a virgin to appease the god of the volcano. And yet, the thought still crossed my mind from time to time. And I wonder, have you ever done the same thing? Have you ever found $5 on the street and thought, oh, God is blessing me? Or, I was looking for a parking space and right there in front of the shop I wanted to go in, it was there. Or, I went in shopping and there was no lineup to get inside, and then they had toilet paper and hand sanitizer. God must love me and be happy with me. Or maybe the flip side is true as well. I just stubbed my toe. Did I do something to offend God? Or my car broke down. Again, I must have sinned somehow. Or maybe worse, I lost my job. My kids are a mess. My marriage is on the rocks. The planes just hit the towers. The pandemic is worse than we thought. God must hate me and be angry with me. Is that how it really works? And what does it mean then when we find ourselves in the situation that we're in now? This morning we're starting a new series. I'm calling it Isolated Faith. How to worship God when you feel all alone. And this is we're going to be looking at the book of Daniel, a study on the book of Daniel. Daniel was isolated. Daniel lived about 600 years before Jesus was born, and his entire story takes place in captivity. Almost 3,000 kilometers away from home, which, is not something I'd want to walk, but, in our day and age, it's not that big a deal. In his day and age, it might as well have been a different planet. 3,000 kilometers away from the temple, 3,000 kilometers away from any priests that he'd ever known, 3,000 kilometers away from any loved ones, even if they were still alive. He was on his own. He probably had no access to Scripture. And it makes you ask the question, how do you maintain your faith when you are isolated and you feel all alone? Well, the answer for today is that maintaining your faith in isolation starts with a determination, especially when God doesn't meet your expectations. I'll say that again. Maintaining your faith in isolation starts with a determination, especially when God doesn't meet your expectations. True faith means choosing to trust in God even when you don't understand. So we're going to get right into it, starting in chapter 1, verse 1. During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, really, there was a fight going on between the world powers of the moment. And Egypt was a strong world power, and Babylon was a strong world power. And Jerusalem, Israel, Judah was kind of caught right in the middle. And Judah tried to side with Egypt at one point, and that basically sealed the deal for them against Babylon. Babylon came in and took them out. Verse 2 tells us that the Lord gave him victory, talking about Nebuchadnezzar. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Now understand what's going on here. And one of the interesting things is to look at what the names are. We'll do that a lot today. The name Jehoiakim means Yahweh raises up. Yahweh, their God, the God of Israel, has raised Jehoiakim into place as the king. Now, kind of interesting about that is that Jehoiakim was a bit of a puppet king for Egypt. So you could make the argument that Pharaoh raised him up, but his name means Yahweh raises up. The name Nebuchadnezzar means Nebu protects the crown. And so you've got, on one hand, you've got Jehoiakim versus Nebuchadnezzar, but really their names and what they believe says it is Yahweh versus Nebu. This is a battle between people, but yes, it's also a battle between their gods. And what happens? Nebuchadnezzar takes the sacred objects from the temple of God and places them in the treasure house of his God. He has captured their sacred things. He's placed them in his trophy case. He is saying, my God can beat up your God. My God is stronger than your God. We won because my God is more powerful. Now, what's really interesting about this is that when you look at what the text says, verse 2, the Lord gave Nebuchadnezzar victory over King Jehoiakim. He permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar is, putting all these things into his trophy case, but yet what Daniel is writing here is that God gave him the victory. Which seems crazy, doesn't it? I mean, why would Yahweh give Nebuchadnezzar the victory over Israel? Israel is supposed to be his chosen people. I mean, these are the people who God helped out of slavery of Egypt. These are the people who God chose for himself. These are the people who God said, I will give you my name. I will be with you. And now he's helping the enemy. Well, it's about to get personal for Daniel. It's one thing to have the sacred objects taken from the temple of God, but verse 3 tells us, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Daniel's one of them. Daniel is one of either the royal family or one of the noble families. Daniel is one of the 1%, and now he's been taken captive. Verse 4 tells us more about Daniel. He says, select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men. He said, make sure they're well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Daniel's a hottie. He's good-looking. He's healthy. He's strong. Think maybe Ryan Gosling, Channing Tatum, Zac Efron, Tom Holland, Nick Jonas. Make your pick. Daniel's, one of the elite. He says, make sure they're well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. I mean, he's not just good-looking and handsome and strong, he's also smart. He's wise. He's the total package here. He says, train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. We'll go on to verse 6. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. Azariah was called Abednego. So understand what's going on here. They have captured these young men. They've taken them from Jerusalem, and they're going to put them into the king's service. Now, this does two things. It keeps anyone who's back in Jerusalem, any of these noble families or royal families, from rebelling. In a sense, they're hostages. But what was interesting about Babylon, I mean, if this was the Assyrian king who had taken them captive, we wouldn't hear anything more about them. Basically they would be dragged off with a hook through their nose and murdered, killed. That was the way Assyria did it. But the Babylonians did something a little different. I don't know if you follow Star Trek, but they were like the Borg. They assimilated people into them. They said, we're going to take the best that you have to offer, and we're going to make you part of us. And so we're going to teach you everything there is to know about Babylon. We're going to teach you the language. We're going to teach you the history, all the things that, probably the religion as well, everything that there is important to know to us, anything that's important for us, for you to know, we're going to teach you. And then what happens is they rename them. In a sense, they're trying to take them away from Israel and take Israel out of them. We want you to become Babylonians. And so they rename them. And we're going to look again at what some of these names mean. The name Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah means beloved by the Lord. Mishael, who is like God? Azariah, the Lord is my help. So these are all names that have something to do with their faith and their religion. I mean, this battle is still going on between the gods. And so they rename them these names. Belteshazzar. So Daniel goes from God is my judge to Bel's prince. Bel was one of the gods of Babylon. Hananiah, beloved by the Lord, becomes Shadrach, illumined by the sun god. Mishael, who is like God, has his name changed to Meshach, who is like Venus. Azariah, the Lord is my help, becomes Abednego, servant of Nego, who was the Babylonian god of wisdom. And so through all of this, we're taking you from your land, your religion, your people, and you're going to become our people, to our land, our faith. They're trying to erase God from the equation. Daniel and his friends are isolated. So how do you maintain your faith in the midst of isolation? When you're distant from all the things that make you feel like you're worshiping God. Let's see what Daniel does in verse 8. It says, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself. Maintaining your faith in isolation starts with a determination. Daniel was determined not to defile himself. It says he was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. Now this was a huge honor for them, to be given food from the king's kitchen. There was a huge disparity between what the royal elites would eat and what the average person would eat in those days, even more so than today. And so they're given special food from the king's kitchen. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating it. Now you might think, what's the big deal? I mean, who cares who cares what you're eating? It's just food. And in some ways, that's right. But for Daniel, who was a law-abiding Jew, there were certain rules and regulations on what he was allowed to eat. Most likely, the food that was given to him by the king would not have been kosher, would not have been according to the law of Moses. It might have been pork. It might have been prepared in a way that was not proper for a Jewish person to eat. But even more than that, it was probably the food and the wine, the meat and the wine was probably dedicated to one of these gods that we've talked about already. And so Daniel says, I'm determined. You can change my name, you can take me away, you can do all kinds of things to me. But I'm going to draw a line in the sand and say, when it comes to what God tells me to do and what you tell me to do, I'm going to obey God. He was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. Again, you might say, what's the big deal? It's just food. It's interesting to note that the very first sin was also related to food. Eating something that God had forbidden Adam and Eve not to eat led to the downfall of man. And so now you've got Daniel, who is in a situation isolated, it would be so easy for him to just say, I'm going to make this break this one rule. It's just a small rule. A man's got to eat. It would have been so easy for him to just say, if God didn't want me to eat this, he wouldn't have put me in this situation. But Daniel chooses not to. He determines in advance, he says, I'm not going to do this. And so he asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. He could have gone on a hunger strike. He could have made a big deal about it. He simply asks the chief of staff for permission. Verse 9 says, Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel, which tells me something about the way Daniel was behaving. I mean, God is able to do whatever he wants, but most likely the chief of staff would not have respect and affection for Daniel if he'd been a little punk, if he'd been, whining and complaining and been miserable the whole time. And so Daniel was acting in a respectful way. But God gives the chief of staff respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, he said, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered you to eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths at your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. I mean, this is another reason why Daniel might have chosen not to make a big deal about this. In a situation like he's in, it would be best not to draw attention to yourself. It'd be better for you probably just to fly under the radar. It could have been offensive to the king. This food is good enough for the king, but it's not good enough for me. But Daniel was determined. Verse 11 says, Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel says, please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. Now, there are a lot of things that are hard to believe in the Bible. This might be one of them. This might be one of the worst, or one of the hardest. You got a teenage boy who is asking somebody to put them on a meal of vegetables and water. But he does it for a reason. Verse 14 tells us the attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. Now, this tells me that there must have been something supernatural going on here. I looked it up. According to livestrong.com, it could take weeks, months, or even years for you to feel the effects of a new eating pattern. With any diet, you need to wait at least 2 to 4 weeks to see how your new overall eating pattern is affecting you. So the fact that something significant is happening, significant enough that they look healthier and better nourished than the young men that are eating the other food assigned by the king, tells me that God intervened here. Daniel was willing to stand up for his faith, and God blessed him. Verse 16 says, so after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel a special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. Now, we started this passage by talking about the things that God did. God gave Nebuchadnezzar victory. God permitted him to take the sacred objects. God gave the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. God gave these 4 young men unusual aptitude for understanding. God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings and visions of dreams. And so what we see throughout this entire story, even though it doesn't seem to make sense at the beginning, why would God give Nebuchadnezzar victory? Why would God give Nebuchadnezzar permission to take sacred objects? Why would God allow the Babylonian God to appear to win over him? But what we see is that God is in complete control. Yeah, there's a battle going on the ground, but God is sovereign in the heavens. God chooses what happens and what doesn't happen. And even though we don't fully understand it, we have to trust that God knows what he's doing. what you find out when you look into the history of what's been going on here, there have been generations and generations of Israelite kings, Judean kings, who have been ignoring God. Every once in a while, a good king will pop up for them, but for the most part, they're all idol worshipers. They're choosing to worship other gods. And so what God is doing here is he is disciplining his children. He loves them enough to say, I'm going to give you a timeout in Babylon. And this goes on for 70 years that the Israelites are in Babylon. But what happens when they come back is interesting. Never again in the history of the Jewish people do they turn away from God. Up until this point, they've always been idolaters, or for the most part, they have been worshiping other gods. But after this Babylonian exile, from that point on, they are God's people. They are dedicated to him. And so what God is doing in this time is that God gave Nebuchadnezzar victory for a short time in the grand scheme of things, so that his people would come back to him and come back with their whole hearts. Verse 18 says, when the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. And the king talked with them and said, no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter regarding wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. God blessed these four young men who were willing to stand up for him. He blessed them with the ability to do things that no one else could do, to do them better than anyone else could do them. And then verse 21 finishes this chapter by saying, Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. Daniel was in the royal service for 66 years. This is over the course of 4 different kings, different empires come and go, and yet Daniel remains constant. Daniel was willing to stand up, to stand for God, and God blessed him. And so what I want you to do right now is to make the decision now to trust God based on who God is rather than what is going on around you. Regardless of your circumstances, trust God. Determine not to let anything else define you. When you choose to accept God's sovereignty, even when you don't understand God's game plan, you're saying that you trust God's character, that you believe that God is good and that he loves you. So as a benediction, I've chosen Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. May we be a church that chooses to embrace God's plan for us, even when we don't understand it, because we know that God is good. Until we meet again, Pine Ridge, take care of each other.